Welcome to the next installment of my quilt block component library. Today we're going to talk about what I call flip and fold corners. I've not actually heard an actual name for this technique from the wider quilt community, so I just call them flip and fold corners. Flip and fold corners are any place there is a 45-degree angle. For instance, we've already done flip and fold corners on this 3-color flying goose. We did flip, we sewed across and we flipped it open. Sewed across and flipped it open. I call these flip and fold corners. So we've already done this. You sew a square across the corner of a rectangle or another square. Or you sew 2 strips together, as I did here. We have a 45-degree angle on this cute little Christmas tree pot holder. There's not a square here. I sewed 2 strips together at a 45-degree angle. And that's another version of a flip and fold corner. So let's talk about my tutorials. Let's go over the standard practice. Remember, as a general rule, my measurements are exact. I almost never, not quite never, but almost never have you make things large, oversized, and cut down afterwards. There is one exception I can think of. I'll tell you when that is. That's not this time. Also remember, I have a distinct dislike for sewing unsupported bias edges. Therefore, instead of having you cut 2 triangles of something to sew on the bias, I do things like make you 2 of something, like the 2 half square triangles that we did, or in this case, the flip and fold corners. I'm not having you cut anything on a 45-degree angle if I can help it. And as a standard practice, this is just a general rule, standard practice of all quilt pattern writers, not just me, but all quilt pattern writers, we give you dimensions in finished sizes, which is the size you will see after you sew a piece into a final product. If we say something is a 3-inch half square triangle, that's the size you will see after it's sewn in. That's not the size you cut it to. So remember, the unfinished size includes a 1/4-inch seam allowance all the way around. We add a 1/2 inch to your finished measurements to get that the unfinished size. So let's get into the math of this. So what I'm going to tell you to do is you need to determine the size of your base unit, whether it's a square or a rectangle. If you were doing, remember when we did the flying geese one at a time, I gave you those measurements. This one is 3x6 finished size flying goose. So remember, that's your finished size. So you need to just take your base unit, which is a rectangle in this case, add a 1/2 inch, and then you take your square, which in this case is a 3-inch square, and add a 1/2 inch. We'll go over all of that. I'll show you making some measurements. Let me show you some other things that are flip and fold corners. Now, one of the things that'll help you on your math is if you draw it out on graph paper. And I actually like to draw things out at full size. I have 1/4-inch graph paper. So remember, we've done this flying goose, and we've done parallelograms, flip and fold corners. We've done the 3-color flying goose. Let's look at some other things. These are drawn out on graph paper at full scale. Let's take a look at this. This is called a trapezoid. Well, what does this look like? Let's take this in and we'll fold it in together. What does that look like? That looks pretty much like a flying goose. So we've already kind of done this. Take a look at this block. This block is called a square and a square. Well, there again, it looks like a flying goose. We've already done this. We're just going to expand out on flying geese and show you other ways that flip and fold corners are. And what if you need stripes on a diagonal? I don't have a name for this block, but we needed diagonal stripes. You don't have to stop with just one flip and fold corner. You have multiple, you have 3 layers of flip and fold corners on this. I'll show you how all these are done. I'll help you out. Let's go to the cutting mat and I'll show you how I make the measurements. All right, let's do some test measurements so you can see how the math works. First, let's work on the square in a square. As I measure this, you'll see that this is a 6-inch finished square in a square. So our base square is going to be that 6 inches plus a ½ inch. So we'll cut our base square to 6½ inches. To determine what size square you need to make your corners, remember it needs to be a square where the diagonal matches up right. So I just folded my graph paper model in quarters, and there you see it's a 3-inch square. I'll lay it flat again, and you'll see I'll lay my ruler on top, and you'll see it's a 3-inch square to get that diagonal. And of course, make sure you add your ½ inch for seam allowances. So you're going to cut your squares for the corners are going to be 3½ inches to make a 6-inch square in a square. Let's take a look at this trapezoid now. If you squish it together, remember, it really looks like a flying goose. So this is basically a wide flying goose. So we're going to do this just the way we did our single flying geese, pretty much. Let's measure this. It measures to be 6 inches wide by 2 inches tall. Add your ½ inch on both dimensions for the seam allowance. So you're going to cut your base rectangle to be 6½ by 2½. For the corners of the trapezoid, you need these squares to be, they measure at 2 inches, so you need to add your ½ inch each direction. So you make 2½ inch squares for the corners of this particular trapezoid. Next, let's take a look at this square that has diagonal stripes in it. Your base square measures at 6 inches finished, so add your ½ inch around, and you need to cut your base square to 6½ inches. The square needed to create the first stripe measures at 5 inches finished. So we're going to add our ½ inch on either side, and we're going to cut the first stripe square to be 5½ inches. For the second stripe, this square measures at 3 inches finished, add our ½ inch each direction for a 3½ inch square for the second stripe. For the third stripe, that little square measures 1 inch finished size. Let's add a ½ inch each direction, and we'll cut the third square to be 1½ inches. Remember, I drew out my models on 1/4 inch size graph paper exactly to scale. If you can, you don't have to do it to scale if you can do the math, like if you want to draw it at half size or whatever. But anyway, so we've got our measurements done. Let's get to the sewing machine and start making these. Let's start making the square in a square. I've got my pieces here. My base unit is a 6½ inch square, and my corner squares are 3½ inches. Draw a single diagonal line on the back of each of your corner squares. You'll notice I like to double check that I actually have a square by lining up the 45-degree angle mark on the ruler with the edge of the square, as well as making sure that, we go through both corners. Once you get that done, you're going to start laying this out. You're going to lay one square right sides together on top of the base square so that the line crosses the corner. We'll sew on that line and then trim off the excess and press the seams outwards. Lay one of your corner squares across the corner of the base square, right sides together, and sew on the line. You can go ahead and do the same with the square on the opposite side. So go ahead and do that now. Trim your seam allowances to 1/4 inch. Open the corners and press the seam allowances to the outside. Sew the second 2 corners the same way you sewed the first 2. Again, trim these seam allowances the same way you did the first 2. Open these last 2 corners, press your seam allowances out, and there you have it. There is your square in a square block. Let's compare it to the paper model, and you will see it looks just the same. Now let's take a look at the trapezoid. So we have our 6.5 by 2.5 rectangle, and we have our two 2.5-inch squares. Easy way to do this, same way we did this before. We're going to draw a single diagonal line on the back of each square, put them on the ends of the rectangle, and sew on the line. Here we go. Trim your seam allowances, open the corners, press them outwards, and there you have your trapezoid. Let's look now at joining two strips of fabric at a 45-degree angle for this type of flip and fold corner. This you'll do like I showed you in the Christmas tree pot holder. You can do it in some long pieces, or if you're doing a straight binding, you'll still be joining those seams at a 45-degree angle. The math on this is just what width do you need? Make sure the two strips are the same width, and of course, add your 1/2 inch to the width and however long your piece needs to be. So here you go. You draw a line at the 45-degree angle on the back of one piece of fabric. You lay it on the other one. It's going to lay on at 90 degrees so that when it opens up along that 45-degree seam, it will be a straight line. So here we go. Draw the line and sew them together. Trim your seam allowances, open the seam and press it open. And there you have two strips joined with a flip and fold corner. Let's take a look now at this last square that I'm showing you. It's got 3 diagonal stripes. So remember, we measured out our base square is 6.5 to be a finished size of 6. And then we have the 3 smaller squares that go in layers up to make this diagonally striped square. We'll start this the same way we've started everything else. Draw a diagonal line on the back of all 3 squares that are going to be the flip and fold corners. Lay the largest corner square on top of the base square, right sides together, sew on the line. Trim the seam allowance and press this square open. Now onto the second stripe, grab the next size square, place it across the corner, and sew on the line. Once again, trim the seam allowance and press this component open. One more time, place the smallest square across the corner and sew on the line. And one last time, trim the seam allowance, open the corner and press it. And there you have your diagonal striped block. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that tutorial about flip and fold corners. We made a square and a square. We made a trapezoid. We made diagonal stripes. And I showed you how to do strips joined on an angle as a version of flip and fold corners. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to like, give a thumbs up to the YouTube video, subscribe to my channel. The algorithm always likes that. Join me on my website. You'll find the printed versions on my website or printable versions on my website. And we will see you next time. Thanks for watching.